Hello, students. For some reason, my dog wanted to be part of this video. Um, Perhaps it is the cultural value that has existed since at least the Victorian era that the British love dogs. When I say they love dogs, they may hate their own relatives, but boy, do they love their dogs. And I must say, I love my dog. I'm I'm making this quick video to talk to you seriously about Victorian era nationalism. Um, if you've watched any number of dramas that Hollywood has concocted about living in Britain in the 1800s, most of them have a reasonable picture of what it was like to think and to be a British subject during the era of Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria does not exactly initiate her own empire. It is the project of a combination of military people and business people who literally create companies that take over nations. The East India Company is one that does that. It takes over India in the pursuit of tea and of opium, which is sold not to take over militarily the country of China, but to make its aristocracy drug addicts. I am so not kidding. You can read about this in history. There are two opium wars fought over this, and to basically drug out the people who run China, so that the British can have what's called a sphere of economic influence over them. So it's not that Britain takes over China; they run Chinese economy. So they own the products that come out of China. They own the products that come out of India. They own the products that come out of some Caribbean islands, which would include things like certain kinds of fruit, coffee, sugar, very important commodities. They also take over parts of Africa and exploit those for precious gems, like diamonds in particular, but not just diamonds, gold and other things, and ivory. The ivory trade is depicted in a short novel that I thought our class was too short for us to read, called The Heart of Darkness, which has a number of flaws, but correctly depicts the colonial attitudes of the day of the project of controlling the economy of the world. And what permitted the British to do this, apart from the Industrial Revolution, was an extraordinary navy. Whatever else can be said about the Victorian era and its many flaws, its extraordinary racism, its astonishing sexism, its exploitation of many peoples for horrible reasons. The poor of England, white poor people of England, were treated like animals in the Industrial Revolution. Living as a factory worker in about 1860 in Britain was a life of hell for so many. It was there was so much wrong with the way things ran in that era, if you were poor or not white or not male. But one thing they did very well was they had a world-class navy, the best navy that anyone had ever seen, which allowed them to have a commerce that no one had ever dared imagine, because it was possible to go get yourself something from China and bring it to the island of Great Britain in a record amount of time. It was astonishing what you could do. And communications through the telegraph, and toward the end of the Victorian era, an underwater cable that allowed them to communicate with other parts of the world through the telegraph and a mail system, even within Britain, that would deliver the mail multiple times a day. They were incredibly organized. And that kind of organization took an extraordinary amount of discipline. And the culture that was engendered here, if you were not crushed under the foot of the Industrial Revolution as one of the poor people, if you happened to make, as a woman, enough of an advantageous marriage that even if your husband was not a pleasant person, but you had a middle class life of some kind or above it, if you were a white man with a business that prospered a bit to extraordinarily, a lot of white men in England got pretty rich during this era. If you were any of those things, there was a sense of the extraordinary opportunity that this presented, because if you were living in, say, London in 1850, and you were middle class, and there was a middle class that was prosperous, you had access to things that were unimaginable. Today, we take it for granted that we can have a cup of tea or coffee, that we can have sugar in that coffee if we want it, that we could have a banana, that we could have a pineapple, that we could have all of these things. Not so in 1800 AD. Pineapples were so very rare in England in the late 1600s that people who were of the wealthiest classes and the aristocratic classes would literally invite people over to show off a pineapple. They would have things called pineapple parties, where dessert was a slice of pineapple because it was so rare. And so in the Victorian era, it became entirely imaginable to get fruits from a foreign place, to get products like tea, which comes from India or China, but does not come from England, properly speaking, to drink out of a cup that is literally made in China. What an extraordinary change that was. And to be able to have an economy that was influenced by a rapidly increasing technological level that today we take for granted. We believe that our amazing iPhones are going to be out of date in about 2 to 3 years. But the grandparents of the people living in the Victorian era had lived in an era where there were no trains, there was no telegraph. News traveled slowly. Agricultural communities were largely insulated. And there were rapid increases in the ability and the mobility of the world, all under this military industrial complex known as the British Empire. And many people who were white, and let me say particularly male, but not exclusively, took this extraordinarily seriously. They thought they had achieved this level of economic prosperity, not because their foot was on the neck of another group of people, but because God had given them this in his divine wisdom, because they could be trusted with it. They were better than other people. There was something inherently superior in their moral lives and in their culture. They believed. They honestly believed that British culture was better than other cultures, including in places with ancient cultures like India and China. And I'm not insulting British culture when I say that when the Chinese were building beautiful palaces and regulating the flow of rivers through a system of canals and dikes and allowing water to flow in an irrigation system, the Anglo-Saxons were picking fleas out of the backs of their goats in the field. It's absurd to suggest that the British Empire was naturally superior to the peoples that they managed to dominate during this era. And the things that they themselves said about themselves is what I wanted to talk about here. First of all, they thought that one of the things that worked very well in their society was discipline. And in fact, their society had a lot of regimentation in it. The rules were very strict and very nearly absolute. And indeed, the British of this era in particular were extraordinarily disciplined. Even flying in the face of reason, they would do their duty as they understood it. That is what they called it. The moral imperative of obeying the rules and obeying the system of ranks, even if what the person above you in the class system said or aristocratic and royal system said didn't make sense. It was the duty of a British subject to obey. And they took that enormously seriously. We see this in the reading that Alfred Lord Tennyson gives of the Charge of the Light Brigade. Those soldiers are heroic precisely because they do their duty. I can't overstate how serious this was to the British. They could not have believed in anything more than possibly God. But even then, God wouldn't have set up a class system with people telling them what to do if somehow he wasn't involved in their British Empire duty. Even to the point, I hate to tell you, of sex. Sex involved duty for women. There was something horrible that happened during the scientific era. Particularly, I am perhaps qualified to talk about it in England. It's horrifying. There was a thought that women ought to have pleasure during sex, and men knew about the clitoris. Yes, your professor talked about the clitoris, and thought that in order for their children to be born prosperous and healthy, their wives had to have orgasms, multiple orgasms, if possible. So women had pleasure in the bedroom during the time up until the 1800s. And then some more medical information was discovered by doctors who were held in some kind of practically priesthood level respect, that women could, even while unconscious, become pregnant, and orgasm was not absolutely necessary for the production of children. And British men too often forgot where the clitoris was. And women themselves had a problem because they themselves were not allowed to talk about such things. Ladies were supposed to be unaware of themselves, and to the point where when the doctor would see them, because it was too shocking to use the word legs, which had certainly existed for at least 1,000 years in England, they would refer to the ladies' lower limbs. Because legs were too dirty. But so women were told that when they got married, they would subject themselves to sex which would be distasteful to them if they were ladies. Women might like sex, prostitutes, but ladies would obviously find the whole experience repugnant. And it was called their wifely duties in this era. And mothers, I kid you not, would tell their daughters about their wedding nights, that whatever happened, because there was not a whole lot of discussion of reproduction for virginal brides marrying into the class of ladies. They were told to close their eyes and to think of England. It was their duty to produce sons for this military industrial complex known as the British Empire. So it was an era where people bought into a myth about themselves that was overblown. The Americans had long since decided the British might have a few good points, but they weren't all that. We fought a revolution to get out from under this growing idea of British Empire. But the British themselves saw themselves in this. By the time we get to the end of this week's readings with Wilfred Owen and Under Milkwood, this idea of British Empire is no longer so absolute. World War I was horrible. When I say horrible, I am understating how horrible it was. World War I was as brutal as almost any war could be, precisely because the technology of the machine gun and the artillery and chemical weapons with gas had all been invented, and medical science had not caught up to help people who suffered from the injuries that were caused by the devastation of these weapons. People who were British, we obviously sent soldiers from the United States. I have a great uncle who fought for about 15 minutes at the end of World War I. He arrived at the last 6 months of the war, so he didn't see the worst of it. But the people who were British, who lived through this war from the beginning, more or less, it was hell. People came back with, they called it shell shock, but PTSD that's hard to imagine. And there was no real discussion of the horror of war. And people came back as basket cases. We get the term basket cases from World War I. And what that meant was people who were quadruple amputees from the injuries they had sustained and literally had to be transported around in a basket. And so many young men were killed. And people asked themselves afterwards, for what? Why did we enter this war? What was the point of it? The way that Americans felt about the Vietnam War, multiply that times 10. It seemed even more useless to the British. And the whole idea of the British Empire as a mythological construct became something they could question. And they didn't know what they wanted to do, because Victorian era had been so prescriptive for everybody about what rank they were in and what they should do. The 20th century provided no such prescriptions. People at the beginning of the 20th century, about 100 years ago, called the young men and women the lost generation because they didn't have these rigid structures of rules. Women got the vote through truly militant activism. And so all of these standards of the lady who would close her eyes and think of England about so many topics, not just sex, largely became subject to question. It doesn't mean there weren't some very traditional ladies then, but there were also the possibility of women not choosing to do any of those things, to do as in the middle of the 20th century during the Second World War, the current Queen of England, she drove a Jeep for the war effort. Not possible in 1900, but by 1940, it certainly was. And there were occasionally during World War I, even a few women ambulance drivers. And so gender opens up. And then the question of racial superiority throughout the 20th century becomes wrestled with in a very overdue and healthy way in England. No longer is there an absolute belief by the end of the 20th century that that being British is to be superior. And there becomes, through, in fact, ironically, all the places that they colonized, an influx of people who influence the British culture itself. And so it becomes more delightfully diverse. Most of the wonderful music that comes out of the last 60 years in England is at least partly inflected by musical traditions that have nothing to do with the British Isles. Um, uh, the culinary tastes, which were so bad, boiled everything. It started to include things like garlic. They could have garlic. They could have spices from all over the world, and that might make the food better. They could have different cuisines. Um, English culture becomes more internationally focused after the Victorian era. And while some have, to this day, seen this as a great loss, many British people see this as their greatest strength. I tend to agree with those British people. I think that Britain is more fabulous than ever because it has decided to welcome the peoples of its diaspora into the discussion of what it means to be British and to write British literature. I thought I needed to give you this kind of information because I should not take it for granted that my students have a lot of information about British history during the 1800s and early 1900s. I think this is enough cultural information to get you started on our readings. I will make another video specifically about the life of Alfred Lord Tennyson and another video that introduces Under Milkwood by Dylan Thomas, an early 20th century work, which I think you will find really beautiful once the strangeness of the language becomes less alienating. It's so pretty. I hope you enjoy all of it, including the most nationalist "he is an Englishman" part of this class. I think you will love it. It really is delicious literature.